Good day, folks. Welcome to Philosophy Roulette. Let us find a paper to read. From Knowing to Understanding, Revising Consent. American Journal of Bioethics. This is a little scary to me. It sounds like it's going to be technical, but hey. Ethical training can turn an ought to a can. So, you lose your, ethics makes you lose your obligation to do stuff. You're just, well, I can do it. I don't know how to do it no more. Let's see. Let's see how long this is. What is this, like one page? Well, this will be like literally the shortest thing ever. Well, hey, maybe I'll do more than one then. Do this quick. Then, I mean, who am I to complain if they want to write papers that are like a page and a half? If you can pull it off, more power to you. If you care to join me live one day, I'd appreciate that. But you can follow along by typing exclamation point paper in the chat, and it'll bring you the link will pop back up, so you can know what I'm up to at any given point. Okie dokie. Okay. Where is up? Here we go. Ethical training can turn an ought to a can. Sisk et al. 2020 argued that once a normative claim is developed, there is an imperative to effect changes based on this norm. Therefore, ethicists should adopt an implementation mindset and collaborate with others to determine how best to actually implement proposed policies and practices. So, development implies imperative, or entails imperative. Okie dokie. We strongly agree in that values-driven fields such as healthcare, there is an obligation for ethicists to go beyond working to raise ethical awareness and even beyond teaching to improve the ethical analysis and skills. Wait, I'm already trying to figure this out. Alright, so beyond teaching to improve ethical analysis and skills of clinicians and administrators. We have argued elsewhere that teaching and training in the practical skills needed to achieve ethical actions should be part of the job description for healthcare ethicists. That said, however, the work of determining how best to implement ethical actions in healthcare organizations cannot be driven by ethicists alone. In fact, developing effective strategies for moving from ought to is must be incorporated into the ethos of the organization and should be a cornerstone value of values-driven leadership. As such, the role of ethics in healthcare organizations should not be seen as one specialty among many. Rather, it should be seen as a valuable lens through which everyone in the organization, and especially organizational leaders, can productively approach complex adaptive problems. I mean, are you guys just is this just an argument for being on the board? I mean, are you guys just trying to get yourself a raise here? I mean, there is a long history of philosopher King saying that the people with the ethical insight should be on top. I mean, it has to go back at least to Plato. I don't know what the other traditions, if they have similar things, but yeah. So this is a philosopher King argument. Okay, The authors assert that healthcare ethicists sometimes focus on debating the naturalistic fallacy, specifically whether ought can be derived from is and is, but that relatively little work has centered on what should happen once a normative claim is developed to implement proposed change in practice. But in fact, there's a long history of philosophical discussions centered on the relationship between normative claims and their implementation. Aristotle, for example, examined this relationship at length in his description of practical wisdom and the role of practical leaders in creating just laws for the polis. Practical wisdom, according to Aristotle, is the virtue of deliberating well, and the person who possesses this virtue considers how to act ethically in light of the situation, the people involved, the purposes for the action, and the means of execution. As Aristotle writes, again, the function of man is achieved only in accordance with practical wisdom, as well as with moral excellence, for excellence makes the aim right, the practical wisdom the thing leading to it. Remarkably, this does not mean that moral choice consists of two separate and distinct components, specifically that of choosing the moral end, the ought, and only then selecting the appropriate means to the end, the is. Rather, the two are part and parcel of the same deliberative process. As such, if the aim seems right but one's proposed implementation strategy cannot achieve the moral objective, the ethical decision is not yet correct. Okay, so there's a pragmatic theory from ought to is, that the is doesn't matter because if the ought can't be pragmatically implemented, then there is no is. Okay. Aristotle applies his theory of practical wisdom not only to personal choices, but also to the decisions that community leaders make in forming legislation. He equates practical wisdom with the ability to legislate well, since the efficacy of law is not only in what it explicitly permits, requires, or prohibits, but also in how the law will influence various other attitudes and actions of individuals subject to the law. In effect, good legislation must account for normative claims in the context of its real-world implementation effects in the community. Similarly, Immanuel Kant, moral philosophy is grounded in the logical premise that ought implies can. According to Kant, for any normative claim to hold moral force, it must be possible to act on it. While he does not go into as much detail as Aristotle about how the process of moral deliberation relates to the realities of moral action, Kant argues that the rational moral choice, or what he calls the expression of pure practical reason, must be able to be carried out by morally autonomous agents. Today, normative organizational ethics should apply the Aristotelian and Kantian premise that norm and their effectuation must be considered in tandem. Normative ethics is, in effect, a practical science, and effective implementation of proposed norms is not simply technical problem solving. It takes place in complex organizations populated by human beings. As such, whether or not proposed change will work as intended has both practical and moral implications. Because normative claims and consideration of their implementation are in fact two sides of the same coin, we agree that ethicists should work on collaborative teams to ensure that the moral and professional values they articulate are effectively implemented through policy and other organizational changes, which can then successfully change organizational habits and practice. Further, this means that ethicists cannot be simply put in charge of developing ethical norms for healthcare organizations. Instead, we propose that values-driven leaders of healthcare organizations should establish the priority of ethics as a lens through which every employee can and should assess policies or practices in the organization. In other words, ethics should not be considered as one factor among many in making organizational decisions. It should be considered as the primary mechanism through which decision makers examine issues and make decisions about how best to address them. Okay, so we've got this argument that because implementation makes more of a difference in this area, that the ethical considerations have to be sort of baked in from the get-go. Okay. I mean, you could. I mean, depending on most, they were saying like normative organizations. Some people in those fields, but I mean, really, most fields are like, at least at some level, I guess, have that sort of thing. you can't really get out of ethical considerations. I mean, nowadays the internet companies, the big internet companies, used to like to say that they were neutral, and that's becoming completely blown up at this point. No one thinks that the like social media or Google is a neutral player in the world at this point. So I'm not entirely sure if healthcare organizations are special in this way. That doesn't mean that the point's wrong. That the ethics should be sort of baked into how decisions are made. But I'm not sure if it. I mean, basically, I'd just be saying that healthcare is not special, but it does have special. It does matter for healthcare just as much as anywhere else, if not. I mean, perhaps more, because you are dealing with life and death immediately. But a lot of stuff matters too. Okay, ethical leadership training. Of course, like all other proposed norms, this view about the optimal role of ethics in healthcare organizations should be subjected to a reality check. And one obvious weakness is that some, perhaps even most, organizational leaders today have not been trained to conceive of ethics in this way. Yeah, the practical understanding of it is, you'd have to fill that out quite a bit. As such, it is a fair critique of our view to note that in many organizations, the ethicists will, in fact, come to the table with considerably more content expertise about the ethical analysis, while others will come with greater expertise in implementation science, as well as financial, legal, and other considerations. Yeah, but that's going to be always the case. Everyone can't be an expert in everything. I mean, there's always going to be somebody better at some. Yeah. In our view, this current reality is not an argument against aiming for the creation of values-driven healthcare organizations that regularly use ethics as the primary lens through which problems are examined and solved. Rather, it is an argument in favor of a deliberative and pragmatic approach toward creating such organizations moving forward. Yeah, this is sort of a pragmatic view, as I said. In particular, it is apparent that if organizational decision-making use ethics as a lens for viewing both problems and their proposed solutions is to work, it will require ensuring that the leaders of healthcare organizations are trained in doing so. Example, Aspen Ethical Leadership Program. A values-driven leader today, like Aristotle's proposed political leader, must understand the current ethical culture of his or her organization and have the skills necessary to deliberate on ethical norms and consider how to implement those norms successfully through policies and procedural change, recognizing that implementing the latter might end up requiring change to the former and vice versa. Finally, like the ethicists within their organizations, leaders need not, and we believe should not, make decisions or conceive of implementation strategies addressing organizational ethics as shows alone. Collaborative teams are important to consider the various factors at play when addressing complex adaptive challenges. The primary responsibility of leaders is to establish organizational ethical values as a priority. They don't need to be experts in every fact of ethical deliberation, just as they don't need to be experts in every facet of implementation science. But core training and ongoing practice in the skills of ethical leadership in healthcare should be a requirement for both senior and emerging leaders in every healthcare organization. Sure. I mean, you can also cast this sort of thing as a risk management, because with the, again, rise of media nowadays and just the sort of distribution of information, you have much more risk when it comes to ethical mistakes than you might have been able to cover it up in the past when you did something dumb. Nowadays, if somebody's racist or somebody has ageist or any sort of bad thing that would look bad on a healthcare organization, it can be much more damaging nowadays because of the distribution of information, and so it could also be cast in some sort of a risk management thing. I mean, people want to be about the ethical standards are important, yes, but frankly, if you're not, the state of the world is not ethical at the top levels usually. So you've got people of different skills with different opinions, and you have to be able to sell this stuff. So this is yeah, okay. I mean, this is a nice little paper about the pragmatics of ethical leadership. Okay, but that's about it. I'm gonna break stream just to make my life easier. I'll be back because this was like 10 minutes or something. So I'll be back in like a minute or two.